So I do research on norms in international relations, and my research has two broad strands. The first is about how different kinds of normative odds, such as international law, morality, personal principles, affect foreign policy decision-making. And the second strand is about how the foreign decision-makers themselves shape norms. And in that vein, I became interested in, I guess, the increasing contestation of international law and norms we've seen in the past couple of decades in particular. And in different kind of ways in which international law and norms can be contested. So one of my projects argued that norms can be contested through behavior and discourse, through behavior, for example, when states don't end up implementing it, but still voice commitment to it. And discursive contestation I've explored also in my recent book a bit more by looking at how sort of different aspects of norms can be contested, and that has implications for the strength of the norms and the reputations of the actors that contest them. And then I guess the third strand of my research that developed out of that a little bit is also to look at the role of international organizations and courts in that dynamic, because they're often the sites where international law is applied and interpreted. So my most recent research project is actually about the drafting of resolutions in the UN Security Council and in the African Union Peace and Security Council. And it looks at pen holding and how it matters. It looks at pen holding, and the literature has found that who holds the pen and writes the first draft of a resolution has a lot of influence over its content. And we find it puzzling that in these two institutions, states sometimes are reluctant to hold the pen, even though they could do so. And so we argue that not holding the pen can also have some benefits. So I guess you could say that a lot of my research is about the politics behind international law and norms. And that goes way back to my undergraduate degree, where I studied an interdisciplinary international relations degree. And the way it was done in Germany was that you would take law courses at the law faculty, economics courses at the economics department, politics courses at the political science department. And I specialized in international law, which I was taught by law professors. And I found interesting that in exams you could get full marks arguing either sides of the argument, that a practice was legal or illegal under international law if you substantiated your argument well. And the professors in their classes also made clear that international law was this living instrument that is in flux and that does set a certain guideline of what behavior is appropriate or inappropriate, but that it also develops further, crucially, when states agree to change the definitions, and when they disagree, that has implications on the law as well. And I felt that in the political science literature on norms, that often was a bit neglected at the time, where it was assumed that norms have a clear-cut meaning, let's say certain human rights norm, and then it was analyzed that whether ratifying a human rights treaty, for example, led to greater compliance. So it is, I guess, a valid assumption at times that some norms are more settled than others, but I felt that meant that sort of the political aspect of interpreting law was a bit neglected. And so I decided to study that. By the time I did my PhD, the literature in political science had well caught up with me and also reached that conclusion, but I still felt that there were certain areas where, I could maybe inject a bit more nuance with my research. So I only joined the School of International Relations a year and a half ago, and I was invited to be a discussant at an event and really enjoyed it and wanted to become more involved. And then I was delighted when I became the co-director of the center together with Marianne Dwyer. And I see it as sort of a real opportunity to create a space for faculty members who are interested in global governance broadly, so international law, political economy, foreign policy, institutions, all things that I'm interested in as well, and just provide a space to share research and ideas, and also to invite exciting guest speakers to see where the discipline is headed. As I explained a little bit, I study contestation of international law and norms, and I think particularly since I finished my book, actually, this contestation has assumed a new dimension with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with the Gaza conflict, with, in particular, I don't know how to call it, the questioning of the Trump administration of the rule-based international order on many different fronts. So kind of the question of whether international law and the rule-based international order can stand up to power. And I think an important insight of the literature is that law gains its strength from there being sort of a community that upholds it and invokes it and criticizes when clear violations happen, because that exercises social pressures on states, which can mean that they might need to change their ways or at least make concessions. And I guess I'm worried that there isn't enough of a rallying cry from important audiences, domestic audiences in the states, international allies in the past of the US, just countries as a whole, civil society, lawyers. And I hope that this pressure is going to increase. I guess the speed with which the erosion or questioning of the rule-based international order has happened maybe has startled a lot of actors. But my hope, I guess, for the future and for international law is that we will see more of that, so that international law can assume more of its, I guess, accountability function in the future. Yeah, so I guess this is my book, The Politics of International Norms. As I said earlier, I guess when I did my PhD, the literature had caught up with my insight that international law is ambiguous and questioned, but I felt that some norm scholars were quite optimistic about what contestation means, and others overly pessimistic. So the ones that sort of saw contestation as an opportunity for international law to gain more legitimacy pointed at how it sort of can be beneficial that more voices become heard, maybe also states that from the global south that maybe traditionally were not involved so much in conversations, and how that can increase the legitimacy of international law. Whereas some other scholars sort of pointed to how disputes over what international law means can weaken it, because it becomes less clear what it means, and then that sort of social pressure that I referred to is in a way less strong or more frizzled. And I felt when looking at the empirical cases that I'm interested in, so I look here at the sovereignty norm bundle, which is basically means disputes over maritime boundaries, the use of force, like for example the 2003 Iraq intervention, Afghanistan, etc. That basically, when looking at them, in some instances for me, contestation did strengthen law and the norms that were contested, and in others it didn't, because sometimes they did become clearer and other times less so. And so I develop a typology of 4 different outcomes that contestation can have, and contribute a bit more nuance. And in the same vein, I've mentioned now that for me, and I guess for many norm scholars, what's important about norms is that they're upheld by this international community that is there, or pretty much reside in them, because it means that there's a certain community expectation to behave in line with international norms. And I felt that the literature so far saw either the international community as this monolithic entity, or as having let's say 3 different concentric circles, as Ian Johnston does, but doesn't really talk much about what happens if one part of the community agrees with an interpretation and the other part rejects it. And so in this book, I differentiate a bit more about the reactions between different audiences, and I find that it's particularly important how the in-groups of a state react to their interpretation, because that state shares a lot of social, cultural, economic ties with them. So if the in-group dissents, then that's costly. We saw that, for example, in the 2003 Iraq intervention, that the US actually really went, and the UK went through a lot of effort to gain the consent from other European states, and when that was missing, that had repercussions. But I also show that in a way, the absence of in-group consent can be compensated if there is domestic support, which sort of also explains in a way why the Iraq intervention still went ahead. So I sort of look at the interplay of domestic audiences, in-group, out-group reactions to norm interpretations, and because this gives us an insight into what allows actors to uphold contestation and to continue questioning the law, or why sometimes they may have to make concessions. And similarly, I look at what sort of kind of arguments can bridge in-group, out-group divides, and can lead to norm clarification and consent on how international law should be interpreted. And here I find that appeals to output legitimacy are particularly important. And I guess the third sort of debate I intervene a little bit into is that sometimes the interpretation of international law and the resolution of disputes is delegated to agents like international courts or tribunals, or sometimes even fact-finding missions like the weapons inspectors in Iraq. And I look at when these agents are able to manage contestation or to gain support for the interpretations, and what, on the other hand, makes that more difficult.